Hello, and welcome to Understanding Warehouse Execution Systems and the Coming Smart Distribution Center. This is a special webcast brought to you by our friends at Softeon. My name is Bob Treblecock. I'm the executive editor of Modern Materials Handling Magazine, and I'll be your moderator for this event. Joining me today from Softeon are Dan Gilmore and Dinesh Dongre. Dan is Softeon's Chief Marketing Officer, and Dinesh is the Vice President of Product Strategy. Now, before we get started, a few housekeeping items. If you haven't done so already, I'd like to remind you that attendees are invited to download today's presentation, as well as some additional material you might find interesting. Just click on the resource icon on your screen. Remember that this is an interactive event. Feel free to submit questions as you listen to the webcast. If we don't get to all of your questions, we'll forward them to Dan and Dinesh later. Now to today's webcast. Warehouse execution systems have been around in various forms for a number of years, but they're not well understood. WS has most often been associated with heavily automated systems, less so for more manual or hybrid DCs, but that's changing. Today, Dan and Dinesh will demystify WMS, WCS, and WES, and maybe a couple of other acronyms. They're going to focus on the new capabilities advanced WS solutions bring to distribution in automated, non-automated, and mixed DC environments. Now, add in artificial intelligence and machine learning, and we're on a path to greatly improve resource management, product flow, and the realization of a truly smart distribution center. So Dan and Dinesh, without further ado, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Bob. This is Dan Gilmore from Softeon. I'm very pleased to be here today for this very hot topic, if you will, broadcast. I'm with my colleague, Dinesh Dongre, both of us from Softeon, and we're very pleased to be here today for this webcast. We're going to try to move right through it. There's a lot of materials, and we're pretty, some real meat here, I think you'll find. But we'll try to get it done in 35 minutes, maybe give or take a couple of minutes here. And this topic, I mean, at ProMat sessions and whatever, it continues to be over the last 3, 4, 5 years, a very hot topic. There is still a lot of mystery about warehouse execution systems, and that's partly because there's a lot of different views, justifiably, on sort of what it is and how it works. But we're going to try to talk both about that and then kind of where this is all going, because a lot of people thought kind of the WMS development was kind of done in a mature application, and what we're finding is there's still lots and lots of room to take WMS and warehouse operations to a whole new level. So just some of you out there may be saying, well, who is Softeon? I'm not trying to be commercial here, but just to give you a little bit of an overview, we're a broad-based supply chain software provider, but you see here on your screen a kind of a Lego-type diagram because we have a variety of solutions on one integrated service-oriented architecture platform that's really kind of led by our warehouse management system solution, which is either kind of in the middle, and then we have all the piece parts around it, the slotting and the labor, what we call resource management, assembly and kitting, yard management, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other kind of key go-to-market product we have is what's called distributed order management. Hopefully you know something about that. They're kind of very big in omni-channel, but also beyond. But that's a topic for another day. We do have some supply chain planning solutions as well, but a broad-based portfolio of solutions, just so you have some idea who the company is. And then more recently, we've released our warehouse execution system. It turned out we actually had quite a bit of WES capabilities bundled under the WMS for many years. Didn't know to call it WES, but we've kind of unpacked that from a packaging perspective and added some new capabilities that really turn it into something different than WMS as well. So that's partly what we're going to go through here today. Just again, so you know something about who we are. You see your typical type logo slide of many different companies. We're very strong in the 3PL business. You'll see people like DB Schenker and NFI and others on here, retailers like Do It Best and Casey's, a $9 billion convenience store chain in the Midwest, tech companies like Lenovo, big auto parts company, Denso, healthcare, OptumRx, omni-channel retail, Duluth Trading, et cetera, et cetera. So just to give you some sense of who the Softeon customer base is. So now I'm going to go through just a little bit of sort of how we got here, okay? And this is actually a presentation or version of a presentation I did several years before I came to Softeon in 2018. And it kind of says this is how the landscape used to be, maybe not all that many years ago, where we had the WMS and we had WCS. WMS, of course, being Warehouse Management System, WCS being Warehouse Control System. And the Warehouse Control System, as we'll explain, is really more designed to be the thing that is the execution arm with the smarts residing in the WMS. So the WMS makes the decisions where the product should go, how they should be merged, or consolidated, et cetera, and those the instructions are sent to the WCS, which execute those moves across typically conveyors and/or sortation systems, but other types of automation as well, shuttle systems, et cetera. So this is how the world, I think, should be organized, but it didn't always turn out that way. This is my friend Mark Freilich, who you may know, his consulting company, Get Us ROI. He talks about here the WMS should have the information it needs to make all the decisions. The WCS should just take that decision and about where the carton goes, deliver it, and then tell us that it's there. So that's, I think, the proper view and the view that many, if not most, would adhere to. But as I say, it kind of didn't always work out that way. In some cases, we had scenarios where there was not only smarts in the WMS, but the brain, if you will, was kind of cut in two, with the WCS taking on some smarts. And, well, how did that happen? Well, there's a lot of examples. I've been in some warehouses where the WMS just didn't have all the capabilities an automation system needed. And so rather than being built in the WMS, those capabilities were added to the WCS. There's some positives there. There's also some negatives in terms of management down the road. But in some cases, it's really the MHA vendor who's kind of in control of the customer approval. They really have a stronger plate at the table with the customer than the warehouse management system does and vendor does. And so they're able to kind of orchestrate things by themselves to maybe that WCS gets to add more value and puts more of the smarts inside there. And then, frankly, there are some times where there's some kind of side agreements almost behind the scenes of the end customer between the WMS vendor and the WCS vendor about the world's going to be divvied up, and sometimes that involves rightly or wrongly, more of the smarts going in WCS. Actually, don't believe that is the correct way, but as I've indicated here, there are times when it does happen. So now we have yet another scenario, and really WES concept has been around for quite a while, but really only become, I would say, prominent in the last 3 to years, maybe 5 years, but really the last 3 years is where the analysts have started writing about it. You're seeing more searches for those kind of products and whatnot. And so what's going on with that? Well, WES kind of came out of the notion that the WMS companies were not adequately addressing several problems in the warehouse. And what were some of those problems? Things like visibility to work in process and various processing zones across piece, case, other replenishment, other types of operations needed to support order fulfillment that WMS wasn't providing sufficient visibility and control there. Most importantly, maybe the notion that the WMS didn't really care about the flow of work based on the automation system. It's kind of looking to optimize its own batch picking or whatever it may be without really being aware of what's happening on the automation. And what that led to was some peaks and valleys, and going most distribution centers with most sortation systems, you'll see it, that the workload coming across the automation was too uneven and unbalanced, and that somebody needed to take that into consideration when executing order picking. And then kind of coming out of that was this notion of waveless picking versus the wave-based processing that the industry's been known for the last 20, 25 years. And I think these are all reasonable things as to why it developed. And what winds up happening there, you see the brain in some cases being in the WES, and the WMS is kind of relegated to kind of inbound and the storage system of record, inventory system of record, and whatnot. But maybe the back end on the packing and shipping part, kind of everything in between in terms of picking and replenishment controlled by the WMS. This is just one view. We have a somewhat different view of this, but this is kind of how we got there. And again, now in this scenario, the WES doesn't have much in the way of smarts. Excuse me. Okay. So here's another view, and you see Gartner here put out a definition maybe about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, and kind of talks about warehouse control systems and kind of being middleware, and its job is to really execute the instructions from the other systems, and we kind of talked about there. Talked about warehouse management system and its capabilities to make business decisions, manage the inventory, and do all that stuff. And then it talks about the WES really being the kind of the system that is going to optimize the automation. And this is a reasonable starting point to have this discussion about these three topics. But where we would disagree with Gartner is this is good, but it positions the WES as only being for heavily automated environments. And we think this is not accurate at all, as kind of indicated in Bob's introduction there describing this. So the reality of it is something more like this. I mean, there's the three vendors or three categories. There's certainly overlap across those categories where it's WMS and WES, WMS and WCS, WES and WCS. I got all my acronyms straight there, or all three together. And a lot of that really just depends on, who the vendor that is that you're working with or considering. There's going to be, if you have three WES vendors in there, you're going to see three very different, probably a set of capabilities that go into those offerings. Kind of what's the roots of the vendor. So a company like Softeon, with our heritage in WMS, as we have the WES solution, the ability to kind of move componentry back and forth based on that SOA architecture between WS and WES becomes a lot more fluid. And so you may have a WMS implementation that borrows, if you will, some capabilities from WES. You may have a WES capability that uses some components and functionality that we would normally consider with WMS, and we'll talk about that in a second. And with that, I'm going to take a brief breath of air. And Dinesh, anything to kind of add to this perspective?
No, I think you've covered where we are, how we've got here, and I think what in all of this, the piece to consider is that when you look at supply chain, when you look at order fulfillment, the intent was never to think about it in silos. But unfortunately, as the industry has matured with tool sets and vendors' offerings and so forth, the behavior and thought process has become siloed, which, over time, the realization has come in that the siloed is not going to help in terms of looking at a broader end-to-end flow. And that's where you see these, overlaps with these different tool sets, that boundaries that are defined, just traditionally by the industry.
Okay, very good. So we'll keep going here. So, if you look here at just, this is, I'm using our own capabilities here to describe, the offering. And you're going to see here a mix of things that are traditional WMS capabilities and other things that are more associated sort of with these new WES capabilities. So let's take that first bullet, advanced cartonization. Is cartonization done within a WMS application today? Absolutely. But there are maybe many times, especially in e-commerce fulfillment, where that cartonization capability really should be part of a WES solution that's going on top of or next to traditional WMS rollout. And you'll see other kind of capabilities there. Dynamic slotting or slotting, for example, typically associated with the WMS. Packing operations on the back end, as I mentioned earlier, typically associated with the WMS. But then you see, some more advanced capabilities, things like wave-based or hybrid type picking. This is something that's kind of coming along through the notion of the WES. Automatic assignment on the right-hand side, the automatic assignment of resources based on processing area based on the capacity and the demand for those services. Various, real-time sort of visibility into all of these processing areas, as I mentioned previously before. So the point of this slide is just to say that the mix of capabilities, whether you're talking WMS or WES, is a little bit fluid with some vendors based on the ability to cross-populate, if you will, either of those two applications with some components of the other. That's really the key point there. And then this was actually information that one of our customers sent us on WES, and we thought it was very interesting. We amended it a little bit, and I wouldn't say it perfectly reflects what we think, but we thought that the fact that it came from a customer is worthwhile. Is here talking about, I'm going to go to the bottom, warehouse control systems, consistent with what I've been saying all along, controls the machinery and the equipment to move the inventory, works best with machinery rather than people. It's not designed to be a human-friendly interface is really the point there. Going up to the top of WMS, controls the inventory and their movements, a single source of the truth. I said before, that inventory system of record, often really more oriented towards the people side of things rather than the automation side of things, like Clay mentioned before. And then we've got the WES, which controls the movements of the inventory within the four walls in terms of optimization. We'll talk about that in just a second. Manage volume and And then, this really, we talked about the smart warehouse. Dinesh in the put wall discussion certainly referenced some of this, but I'm going to go over it again here. If you think about what happens in many DCs, you have at the beginning of the day, things are pretty good, everything's in green, but you've got the SLAs and the UPS truck or the FedEx truck that's got to go out, and other demand or shipment requirements that are pushing the operation. And what happens in 9 times out of 10 facilities towards the end of the day, there's a little bit of a panic mode that goes on. Everyone's scrambling trying to get these last bit of orders out. Often some cartons or shipments are missed, and it's just a very stressful and not a very smooth capability. And so you think about that level loading that I talked about before. It's mostly thought of in a sortation system type of context. It can still be in a sortation system kind of context, but it can also just be in a more general processing areas in terms of meeting the requirements and the shipping schedules that are already in place. And so what you want, obviously, is a nice green path that considers what the outbound requirements are and then releases orders automatically to ensure there's enough time to meet those service level agreements. So early in the day, you want to have as big a batch or pool as you can, because the bigger the batch or the pool, the greater the optimization capability. But as the day goes on, you want to increasingly start focus on those cutoff times. And if you've got a FedEx truck leaving at 4 o'clock, obviously you need to work backwards from that based on the time it's likely to take you to complete and transport those orders to shipping, such that they're released in a way that's going to make those service agreements without a manager having to fret over, am I doing this early enough, or am I doing it too early? Am I making the right decision? All the kind of things we see happening in warehouse after warehouse today. So you see here a little visual that just says, okay, I've got this pool of orders at the beginning of the day, and some of them, need to be executed by late morning, and so I'm going to, release some of those picks. Maybe I got some extra capacity, so I'm going to grab a couple of the green ones. But then, I got another block of time, 11 to 1. I'm going to automatically. This is not weight-based necessarily, but this is automatically understanding the cutoff times and the processing times, and sending those orders out to the floor in a way that that's going to meet those requirements. Then I got a last pool at the end of the day. This is just a very simple example. It doesn't do it nearly justice. And Dinesh, I'm going to ask you to just explain this kind of what I call pull-based distribution that WS can really provide.
Yeah, I think, the simplistic context here would be if I had a profile of orders that are static, that I know ahead of time that this is the different cutoffs, then it's a simple equation of prioritizing and saying, okay, here's the orders and this is the sequence in which you want to process them. But the real, the true reality is that the purples that you see would have maybe started as yellows that became purples because, the carrier called in and said he's not going to be picking up on time, or he's going to be 3 hours late. So the real key to call out here is in terms of how we're looking at smoothing this is, and, some of that text there calls out the different, parameters that go into this, is that underlying, dynamic rules, which are actually controlled by operations. It's not a vendor-driven thing. It's not static by any means. So the ability to, dynamically, orchestrate things based on rules that reflect, a specific, context of a DC or a customer, and allowing for this kind of an output at the end of the day, independent of the variability of the various factors, prioritization of replenishments, incorporating whether you have, inventory in dock that needs to be accounted for or not, carrier schedules, expected ship dates, hot orders, whether consolidation is required or not in the orders that you're processing, so on and so forth. Accounting for all of those variable data sets or attributes that typically reflect our day-to-day behavior, and dynamically orchestrating that with the right prioritization to ensure the right people are working on the right thing at the right time to get this kind of a seamless output, or the green that you saw in the previous slide, is the real key, and all that being done without human intervention.
Yeah, and that's really the kind of key point there at the end of this. And we'll talk about that in our kind of closing up here. But this notion of automated or autonomous processing, this is what's really going to drive the smart distribution center of the future. And so this is just the same kind of thought, but in a more automated way. And so when you've got, whether it's, light automation, that I don't even know what we're calling automation, but certainly technology in terms of things like put walls or whatnot, whether it's a case sorter, whether it's a unit sorter, and you've got different processing areas, case picking, piece picking, all the replenishments going on there. By a combination of real-time visibility into both sides of that equation, the work can really be metered out in a way that provides that level loading and that consistent flow that's going to drive utilization rates up, and whether that's you take advantage of that in terms of just greater throughput, or in the design phase, maybe a little bit automation required to get the same result, kind of up to you. But this is, again, kind of where we're headed. And this frankly is a little bit more of the traditional WES view. What we tried to say is, beyond this view, there's a whole bunch of other views about what WES is and can do to your operation. Okay, so we kind of did you anything you wanted to add to that, Dinesh, just before I close it out?
No, I think that you covered that. Yeah.
Okay. So let's kind of wrap it up here. What are the kind of benefits that we're seeing from this sort of next generation WMS? Certainly, everyone's concerned with productivity, whether that's cost or throughput, but certainly seeing double-digit type improvements for a variety of reasons. Hopefully, as we made somewhat sense of today, in terms of the ways that can happen, multiple places and multiple ways in the operation, from optimization to automated order release and things along those lines. We're seeing a lot of ability to better manage and reduce overtime. That's a whole other topic there, but we're seeing some very interesting use cases there in terms of how people are thinking about the overtime equation. That improved throughput. I just said that a second ago. And what I think what's really happening here is what WES is allowing is the system to close the gap between the theoretical throughput of your facility, whatever you've got, manual, hybrid, or full automation. How can I get the actual throughput much closer to the theoretical throughput? Of course, it's never going to 100% get there, but can it get a lot closer? Can I get 10% more? Can I get 20% more? I think the answer to that is yes, and that's a humongous benefit for customers in virtually any scenario there. Easily and quickly deploy these new subsystems, but not only now, but in the future. And we kind of talked about that, and hopefully that made some sense to you there. It shouldn't be as difficult as it is to add some of these kind of capabilities like put walls. It should be a lot faster, a lot easier. Consistently meet those service requirements, as we talked about, with a lot less chaos, as we referenced just a second ago, that MHE utilization. And again, just making the point that this is for automated, manual, or hybrid DC. That's one of the key takeaways, really. And some of our early successes were actually in non-automated or hybrid type distribution center environments. So I'm going to let Dinesh comment on this certainly, but where all this is headed, we really are at the beginning of the era of what you might call, and Gartner kind of refers to it as this as well, as autonomous warehouse software. And you hear Dinesh a couple of times talk about the system making the decisions about what work to release when, and doing so without a human manager needing to make those calls. This is going to be a whole different game in WMS, I'm telling you, or WMS plus WES. It's a very, very different model, and one that's, this is where the artificial intelligence and the machine learning can also come into play. I'll just talk about that in a second. That self-tuning capability that you see there on the screen. And, it really is an advanced focus on product and process flow. You can eliminate that dwell time, issue that's going on in the distribution center so often, and we're kind of using the thinking about the term flow distribution with some parallels to flow manufacturing that was invented many decades ago. Can we have that same kind of leanish type model that really takes a lot of the waste and the dwell time out of operations? We think so. So with that, hopefully, Dinesh, anything to add to this, concluding things up?
Yeah, just a couple of quick things, again, in the interest of time, keep it brief here. Outside of everything that Dan has shared here, I think two things to call out, from when you talk about autonomous or automated behavior with minimal human intervention, the key is, again, think of it not necessarily in the context of a static environment, meaning, 3 put walls, 10 cards, 15 resources, and so forth. It is about, and optimizing just for that set, it is about extending that seamlessly, and that's where the non-human part comes in, to account for optimizing across varying capacities, having, based on some seasonal profile. Let's just say you want to add 2 more put walls, or you're going to have temp workers. Accounting for increase or decrease in capacity, increase or decrease in order volume, so forth, dynamically orchestrating that with minimal human intervention, minimal to no human intervention, is really what we're calling about. I mean, the autonomous flow in a static context is part easier, to accomplish, but to make it dynamic, where the ability to define what the dynamic nature is, how far you want to look ahead, how quickly do you want to react to volatility within the four walls, and allow that to be, an operation or super user, if you will, who can manage that. And that is the big crux of what, when we say a next-gen WES, outside of all the other capabilities. Now, and when you think about AI, ML, and all of that, so we've talked a lot in terms of how do you reprioritize and do all that, or level load, whether it's historical data, whether it's projected data, whether it's in the context of simulation or in context of tactical execution on, day-to-day. At some point, inferring information out of pure statistical models, is only so limited. So extending that to be able to incorporate some of the newer AI/ML techniques to infer more intelligence from those data sets, or a more discrete or disparate set of data sets. That's the key, and I think that's where this is all headed when we talk about AI and ML. And then, the last piece I will just say is, IoT is a context and conversation that's been around for a long time. But I mean, if you just think about, resource capacity and so forth, things of, a robot running low on a battery, for it to automatically, create signals from in the context of like an IoT, and for a WS equivalent to recognize that capacity is going to be limited, instead of somebody, having to define whether the capacity is available or not. Again, so taking away the human intervention and seamlessly tying in. So that's a big piece. So that's when we talk about where it's headed. I would suspect that is where it really needs to go, and that's where it's likely to be in the next, 3 to 5 years. All of these, paradigms that we're talking about have been in the market, have been exposed, have been pursued for the past couple of years, but they have not definitely taken off to the extent, to the point where they're productionized and fully put in use. And so that is what we will see. And I think WES, in the context of a tie-in between, inventory management and receipts, and, driving or, automation in some form, the transport, if you will, tying them together to make it all work seamlessly is, I think, going to be the key.
Yeah, very good.
So that's
okay,
it. I think
very good.
Sorry.
So just one brief ending commercial plug. So we see we're talking here about the warehouse of the future, but we think a lot of it is available here today from Softeon. So thank you very much. And Bob, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dinesh. And thanks to all of the attendees. I found this a really fascinating conversation. I've been interested in how WES is evolving, so I learned a lot today. I hope you did as well. And I would like to remind everyone, we have a few questions here already. Remember that this is an interactive event. Feel free to submit your questions. If we don't get to all of them, we will forward them to Dan and Dinesh later. So Dan, Dinesh, I'll let you guys decide who wants to field the questions. But the first one is, you referenced the use of simulation. So how does that work in the context of a WMS?
Yeah, Bob, I'll take a first stab, and we'll try to keep these very brief. And obviously, if you have any more detailed follow-up you want to do, as Bob suggested, we'd be happy to do that. So simulation, we kind of view it as a couple ways. We have what we kind of consider strategic simulation, which is a bigger picture thing, and you really can think of it more as what-if analysis. What if I make this change? What if I add this equipment? What if I do something else, and see how that's really going to play out against a real set of orders, say a day's worth of orders from last October. And then, a more tactical simulation, as we talked a little bit about today here, in terms of playing out an actual or forecast set of work across the resources and capacities I have today, this shift, or the next 4 hours, or whatever it happens to be. And interestingly, with the strategic simulation, one of our early WS customers we were able to estimate a productivity gain that was likely to come from WES, and we're able to get the actual turned out to be very, very close to that forecasted number based on simulation. So this is really very different kind of capability. Simulation's been around a lot in materials handling, but bringing it to the software world is a bit different. But we'd love to explore with anybody out there a little bit more about how we're using it.
Great.
So
Well, thank
only
you.
one piece to add.
Go ahead, Dinesh.
Sorry,
I'm
Bob.
sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
just one piece to add to that simulation piece is that beyond strategic and tactical, there's, once you have that framework, then it's a lot easy to define new use cases. And I think the one, while not as significantly visible, is the effect of using simulation to actually mimic things that you would traditionally do in a long cycle UAT. So, the byproduct, if you will, of the simulation, either strategic or tactical, is that you also have an ability now to kind of get optimized in your, implementation life cycle, if you will, by being a bit more creative in UAT, whether it's testing retail compliance labels across, a plethora of retailers that you support and so forth. So there is a byproduct where you're also affecting the ability to reduce your implementation timeframe.
Thank you. WES has often been associated with waveless picking. So at Softeon, what's your take on waveless?
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about that. I think, one of the problems is WES, some of the early incarnations, if you will, were all about waveless picking. And there's obviously room for waveless. We talked about there, in the broadcast, but, wave-based also has its place. When you're dealing with things like, small parcel shipments, or you're talking about store replenishments where you're just fluid loading a truck that's going to store 31 or whatever, you have a lot of flexibility there to sort of release work in an optimal way, because it's just going to flow into that truck whether it gets there at 10 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so their waveless picking, other types of unit sorters, makes a lot of sense. But, you still got the Werner truck and the JB Hunt truck showing up, and those kind of scenarios where maybe a wave-based process makes more sense. You want to do some smart things in terms of the automation. We have a concept we call master wave and sub waves that has proven itself very useful in some automation scenarios there. And we have customers that are running dual environments. So waveless in, say, the e-com area, but wave-based or largely wave-based in the rest of the operation. So waveless is important. It can then deliver some real benefits, but it shouldn't all be waveless.
Yeah, I concur.
Okay. Dinesh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure I didn't speak over you there.
Yeah, no.
Here's a question. Yeah, here's a question I think is kind of an important one. So the Softeon WES, does it only work with the Softeon WMS, or can I layer it in if I have another WMS?
Yeah, Bob, it can work with any WMS. We actually, we was kind of, some of these capabilities were kind of specifically a part of the WMS before we even realized we had WES, as I said at the beginning. But what we did in terms of extracting that, if you will, and then packaging it up into a standalone product, obviously it's got all the hooks and integration at the get-go to the WMS, and as I mentioned, can even borrow components of the WMS, whether that's cartonization or packing or small parcel shipping or any number of different things. But it also was architected so, in a way that the inputs and outputs to the system are basically the same, whether it's a Softeon WMS or some third-party WMS. So that's really why we did it the way we did it, as a separate product rather than just implementing it as a WMS. One of the reasons as part of the WMS, because we wanted to be able to provide this to customers regardless of what the underlying WMS is.
Yeah, I mean, the extension to that is, no different than WCS. So, I mean, the whole notion, from software, and I would suspect, most vendors hopefully are looking at the same way, is not being beholden to a single vendor software set, because, there are certain things that, that does not necessarily align itself to core competency for a certain vendor. So, but it is required as part of an overall process. WCS as an example, for a WMS or a WES vendor to take on controlled software and, how conveyors are, running and so forth is not necessarily the most optimum way. So being agnostic to a WCS is critical for a WES to work well in any environment. And so same way upstream, being agnostic to the WMS is also a crucial factor for success.
I have, if you don't mind, I have one personal follow-up question, just because I have gotten interested in this sort of evolution of WES. And when I talk with, who I won't name, but some other, like one of the voice vendors who's doing this, They're even looking at WES because of the workflows that it can do to customers that either are, maybe getting WMS Lite from an ERP system. There are some retail-specific ERP systems, for instance, that have, kind of a light version of WMS, or even for companies that have not put in a WMS, but maybe can get their order management from an ERP, and then the WES can take over. Now, they're going to be, not complicated facilities, but can you see the WES almost as a standalone solution?
Yeah, and we've seen. Go ahead, Dinesh. I'll let you take this one.
Certainly, because if you're looking at any upstream, whether it's WMS, which is a bit more, which probably has a bit more intelligence in terms of product placement. I'm talking of like reserve areas and so forth, placement and travel path to replenishing and so forth. But if that sophistication is not required, it's a fairly simplistic where you have a light or an ERP handling some of that stuff. A WS standalone is effectively taking a pool of orders, and then again we talked about the WS capability slide, whether cartonization is part of it, whether slotting is part of it, whether replenishment is part of it. So that depending on the scope of the WS, effectively then it can manage the rest of it as far as just an input is concerned, just as an inventory, feed that says here's my inventory, and whether it's a single virtual location or it's multiple locations, depending on how that needs to be structured, then and orchestrating everything that needs to happen for that pool of orders, and with incremental movements of inventory as appropriate within any subsystem that requires to be in place for picking, and then handing off confirmations to the ERP or any upstream system later on is completely feasible, because the WMS, in terms of the sophistication that is needed outside of pure picking in terms of space utilization, organization, so on and so forth, if that's not required, then a WMS to a degree can be taken out, and you can incorporate that into a slightly broader footprint of WES.
Dan, anything to
Did I
add?
answer the question? Yeah?
Yeah, no, I think that's good, Bob.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. I'm watching the clock here. You ended the slide, or you ended the presentation, which what I thought was a pretty interesting slide about the autonomous WMS. So if you think about that solution that you're thinking ahead of, how close are we to an autonomous WMS solution?
We're on the edge. Okay, I think this is a multi-year evolution, if you will. But if you look at what we're already doing now, as we discussed in some manner today, we are, and certainly with as you start to incorporate the AI and the machine learning into it, although that's only part of the answer. There's other aspects of how you make this autonomous. We're on the certainly on the beginning of the slope, no question about that. I think one of the questions is going to be there's always going to be some adaptation, I guess, if you will. This is a different paradigm, and people are used to, certain, human-based activities or whatever running at WMS. You've been running an old WMS for years. It works this way. Now you come up with a model that the WMS is taking over a lot more of the decision-making. We could say this is going to be an issue for, any kind of, smarter products through AI or otherwise that we're seeing there. So, but this isn't some distant future, Bob. This is something that is already being delivered. A substantial amount of the vision I think we can deliver today, and I think the rest is going to come over the next handful of years. Dinesh, are you with me on that?
Yeah, no, I think I'd agree. The key really is like anything else. I would equate this a little bit to, adopting cloud for WMSs. So it took a long time for people to get over a psychological barrier, be it security, be it control of data, so on and so forth, to feel comfortable about handing off, if you will, data and infrastructure from within their control to something outside of their control. Likewise with WES, I think it is going to be the same. As software as a technology, I think is significantly there today, but it's not a static context, because there is new technologies that are coming into play that are applicable in the warehouse space, supply chain execution, whether it's robotics, IoT, so on and so forth. So they will continue to adapt with the new paradigms. But the bigger question in terms of how mainstream this will be or how adopted it would be is going to be a bit of the similar context, people getting over the notion of trusting a software or a piece of system. However deep the AI or ML embedded is, or however light it is, or however lack of equivalent context it is, to accept that as, if for nothing else, that's the Bible, and let it run. So that fear of handing over that control is probably going to be one of the bigger challenges in terms of how prevalent this is going to be.
Yeah, and I just jump in real quick. I mean, yeah, I just real quick. What we weren't showing PowerPointware or Visionware or whatever today. What we presented today is real stuff that's available today. So this isn't a theory. There's more to do, more work to do, but we're certainly in the early stages.
Well, thank you. For Softeon, for Dinesh and Dan, I'm Bob Trebilcock. I want to thank all of the attendees who joined us today. And again, remember, if we didn't get to all of your questions, we will forward them to Dan and Dinesh to get back to you later. So again, for Softeon, for Dan, for Dinesh, I'm Bob Trebilcock from Modern Materials Handling, and thank you again for attending.
Thank you.